Today, London is one of the most influential cities on the planet, a global metropolis crossed by wide avenues, monumental bridges and buildings that seem to touch the sky. But if we erase all of that for a moment, the cars, the traffic lights, the concrete, the glass, what remains here? We are going back more than 400 years in time. The year is 1600. Before you is not a modern capital, but a dense, noisy and deeply human city. London was already large by the standards of the time, with hundreds of thousands of inhabitants crammed into narrow, winding, poorly lit streets. The air was heavy, mixing smoke from fireplaces, the smell of damp wood, and the constant odor of the River Thames. The city was growing too fast for its own good. Houses were piled on top of one another, many built entirely of wood, with upper floors jutting out over the streets. The risk of fire was constant. Diseases spread easily. Even so, London attracted people from all over England and beyond. Merchants, craftsmen, sailors, apprentices, beggars and nobles shared the same urban space. It was a city of extreme contrasts. Wealth and misery lived side by side, separated by only a few walls. In this video, we use artificial intelligence-based reconstruction, drawing on maps, engravings, and historical records to walk through this 17th century London. Not to judge it with modern eyes, but to calmly observe what it was like to live here when the modern world was only just beginning to take shape. London's location has always been its greatest strength. Built along the banks of the River Thames, the city developed as a natural point of connection between the interior of England and the open sea. Long before 1600, the river already functioned as the main artery of trade, transport and communication. At the beginning of the 17th century, virtually everything entered or left London through the Thames. Merchant ships brought grain, timber, textiles, wine and spices. Others departed loaded with English wool, metals and manufactured goods. The riverbanks were intensely occupied. Wooden docks, warehouses, shipyards and markets spread along the water. The constant sound of ropes, hammers, voices and bells filled the air. London was not a planned city. It grew in an organic, almost chaotic way. Streets appeared where paths had once existed. Alleys formed between improvised buildings. Few roads were wide enough for carriages to pass easily. The city was still partially surrounded by ancient Roman walls, but they could no longer contain its growth. Suburbs spread beyond the traditional limits, especially along the roads that led to other regions of the country. By 1600, London was no longer just an English city. It was beginning to become a global city, connected to trade routes that extended across Europe, Africa, and the newly explored Atlantic world. Walking through the streets of London in 1600 was an intense experience for the senses. The ground was rarely paved. Mud, food scraps, and human waste accumulated, especially after rain. The houses were narrow and tall, with exposed wooden structures. Many housed several families at the same time. Inside, a single room could serve as kitchen, sleeping area, and workshop. Life began early. Artisans opened their shops at dawn. Blacksmiths, bakers, tailors, and carpenters worked with their doors open, allowing the sounds and smells of their labor to spill into the street. Most people lived from manual labor. Children helped from a very young age. Women took care of the household, managed family businesses, or worked as washerwomen, seamstresses, and vendors. Food was simple. Bread, porridge, salted fish, vegetables, and weak beer were part of daily life. Water was rarely consumed on its own, as it was considered unsafe. Beer was more reliable. At night, the city grew dark quickly. Few streets had lighting. Candles and torches cast unstable shadows on the crooked walls of the buildings. Despite the hardships, London was alive. Conversations, laughter, arguments, and music spilled out of taverns. It was a tiring, dirty, and noisy city, but full of movement and opportunity. Some places concentrated the identity of London in 1600. London Bridge was the most impressive of them. More than a simple crossing, the bridge functioned as a street suspended over the river. Houses, shops, and workshops lined its entire length. Seen from a distance, it looked like an entire neighborhood floating above the water. Navigation beneath the bridge was dangerous. Its narrow pillars created strong currents, causing frequent accidents. Even so, it was essential, remaining the only permanent crossing of the Thames in the city centre for centuries. Another dominant symbol was the Tower of London. By 1600, it already served as a fortress, prison, arsenal, and royal treasury. Its presence reinforced the authority of the Crown in a city that was constantly growing. Westminster was also gaining importance. It was home to Parliament and Westminster Abbey, the political and spiritual centre of the kingdom. The river directly connected Westminster to the City of London, making river transport more efficient than any road. Open-air markets, parish churches, and improvised squares completed the urban landscape. Each structure reflected a city that still mixed public, private, and commercial functions without clear separation. London in 1600 lived under constant pressure. Rapid growth brought problems that were difficult to control. Fires were a permanent threat. Most buildings were made of wood, and the use of open flames for cooking and heating made any carelessness potentially catastrophic. Diseases spread easily. The bubonic plague still made regular appearances. Entire neighborhoods could be sealed off overnight. Social inequality also became increasingly visible. While merchants grew wealthy through international trade, thousands lived in extreme poverty. At the same time, London stood at the center of a world in transformation. Maritime trade was expanding. England was beginning to compete for space with other European powers. Religious, political, and scientific ideas circulated with greater intensity. The city was becoming a place of debate, conflict, and change. All of this was preparing the ground for major events yet to come. London stood on the edge of a new era without even knowing it. As we move forward in time, it becomes clear that the London of 1600 laid the foundations of the city we know today. Its winding streets shaped the urban layout. The river remained the central axis of economic life. Many of the places we saw still exist, even if transformed. London Bridge changed, Westminster grew, the Tower remains standing. The city would continue to face fires, epidemics, and wars, but it would also reinvent itself repeatedly. Each historical layer was built upon the one before it. Walking through London today is walking over centuries of decisions, mistakes, and adaptations. The modern city was born from these narrow streets, these noisy markets, and these busy banks of the Thames. Through this reconstruction, we caught only a glimpse of what it was like to be here when the modern world was still taking shape. If you enjoyed this journey through time, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us which city you would like to see reconstructed in the next video.